So there needs to be a change. And so we looked at what are schools doing to make some radical changes to still offer a really excellent personalized education, but do it at a massive cost difference.
Hi, I'm James Taylor, business creativity and innovation keynote speaker, and this is The Creative Life, a show dedicated to you, the creative. If you're looking for motivation, inspiration, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's an author, musician, entrepreneur, performer, designer, or thought leader. They'll share with you their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, and much, much more. You'll find show notes for this episode, as well as free training on creativity, over at jamestaylor.me. Enjoy this episode. Hey there, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Stephen Wunker. Stephen is a noted author, entrepreneur, and consultant whose new book, Costovation, solves the dilemma of how to spend less and innovate more. He led the team creating one of the first smartphones in the 1990s, teamed with Harvard's Clayton Christensen to build out consulting practices, and since 2010 has led New Market Advisors, whose clients include Nestlé and Nike. His writing appears in Forbes, Harvard Business Review, and the Financial Times, and it's my great pleasure to have Steve join us today. So welcome, Steve.
Thanks very much, James. Great to be here.
So share with everyone what's going on in your world just now.
So I am focused on our new book, Costovation, which just came out. This is our third book, and it's really the book that attempts the biggest topic. Because even though we try to be concise, we're taking on the whole business, not just the product, not just the customer, although those are very important, but really what can you do across the whole business, including things that are invisible to a customer, to attain a radical step in your affordability or your cost position.
And I think it's really interesting because so many times you see innovation books which are just focused on generating new product ideas. So you've taken a different tack with this, kind of going through the cost, which obviously every company wants to look at ways of reducing costs, becoming more efficient as well. What was where did this idea come from of really focusing more on the cost side rather than just generating kind of new product ideas?
So I had seen this disconnect in our clients between the people who were responsible for coming up with the new products. And oftentimes they were chasing premium customers, premium prices. And then on the other side, there were folks in operations or general management who were all about cost containment. And there was this tension between the two sides. And then we had a while ago, about 6 years ago, we had an executive from a large Dutch conglomerate come to us and say, well, I'm basically in a commodity business and I've come to accept that. What I need is help with costs. What can you do with that innovation toolkit on the cost side of the equation? And for me, that's when the light bulb went off. That's when I realized that these two camps didn't need to be living in opposition, but rather you could really get the innovators working together with the operators, the general managers, to do things in the guts of the business, not just about adding bells and whistles to get the next bump up in price.
And it's interesting on that area, but thinking from the cost perspective, I often think a lot of the tools that we kind of think about in innovation, they maybe come from the world of advertising. For example, that's selling a new product, some new product launch is happening and people want to innovate either around the product or the marketing campaign, for example, as well. So some of the clients, when they kind of come to you now thinking about cost, is the driver of that is because they're having really to adapt to change, technological change, and that's what's happening, or is it just that this is a key part of their promise? Is they're a cost-driven type of organization?
So I think it's a bit of both. You certainly see companies that are under pressure from disruptive forces. And so they need to do something significant because there's some new rival out there that has a 30% cost difference, or something that cannot just be wished away. But equally, we find that people are having harder and harder times meeting their cost targets. There's a study that we quote in the book from Deloitte that looked at the percentage of surveyed executives that could meet their various targets back in 2008. So for cost reduction, about half the people surveyed were able to meet the cost reduction targets. And then in 2016, that had fallen to about 15%. So people have done lean, they've done Six Sigma, they've cut out a lot of the fat, the waste. It now is required to do something that's really different. And I think that gets to your point about the advertising techniques, the design thinking techniques. What can you do really stimulating different sort of thinking to go focus on those costs and not just on the marketing side?
It makes me think when I hear this as well, obviously we're talking a lot about business, but I think this is something that like governments, for example, could use. For example, in the UK just now, they're always looking at ways to reduce costs, and they always talk about big cost reductions in departments, for example, and they never manage to achieve it because they're trying to do the same things, but just a little bit cheaper rather than actually reinventing the actual process itself.
Well, that's absolutely right. So one of the inspirations for this book was also being a trustee of my kids' school. And this school is fabulously innovative. The teachers do a great job of coming up with what's new. But the tuition keeps going up 3 or 4% a year. And, pretty soon you're the entire economy of Massachusetts. So there needs to be a change. And so we looked at what are schools doing to make some radical changes to still offer a really excellent personalized education, but do it at a massive cost difference. So yeah, you're right. It's not just for-profit companies that have cost issues.
So where did this all begin for you? I mean, where did your passion, your interest in innovation come from?
Well, look, I always loved starting things. I was the kid in high school who decided we needed a planetarium, and I went and renovated this room and built one. It didn't score me many points socially, but I love that stuff. I started up a nonprofit in college. I love to just look at issues and figure out if there's a new solution for them. You mentioned I was involved in the creation of one of the first smartphones. Look, at the time, we did not have an inkling of how big that would become. We thought it was a good idea, it was worth doing, but no idea that it would become so super huge. But for me, this was a really sexy sort of challenge. What can we do with this PDA? And if we just add a phone to it, is it purely, okay, now there's another app that's called Phone, or can you start integrating things in some really neat ways? And look, this was early days. This was 1999. So it was 8 years before the invention of the iPhone, and there was a lot of learning that the industry still had to do. But having that sort of canvas to go paint what your imagination allows you, that's really a thrilling thing to do, I think.
There was an interesting program I was watching the other day about Nokia, talking about the smartphones and actually how a lot of the things that we take for granted now in smartphones, they'd actually invented some of those things first, some of those features, but they became quite bloated as a company, and they weren't able to kind of disperse that information and that knowledge and continue to take risks. They'd become very familiar in what they'd managed to build up, and they had a real good market dominance, and they got Apple kind of completely came at them and was able to really dominate very, very quickly. So when you work in a lot of organizations, I'm wondering, how do you start to embed this idea of like Costovation, not just in the senior leadership of an organization, but ensuring that it starts to kind of filter down throughout the rest of everyone else in the team?
That's a great question. So look, I think it starts with knowing why you're innovating or costovating to begin with. Are you doing it because you're afraid your prices have become unaffordable? Are you afraid of a disruptive entrant? Are you preparing for the next recession? We don't know when it's going to come, but it will come. And this is actually a really good time to start preparing for one while things are still pretty good. Those different justifications drive very different mandates from leadership about what you're trying to do. Is it some super secret skunkworks project? Is it a wholesale innovation in how you do business? And then as you go about not just knowing why you're innovating, but whom you're innovating for. It may not be the innovation in the product, but you need to know who your customer is still and what they really value. So as you make trade-offs, you don't leave them feeling robbed. Ideally, you want to leave them feeling delighted because you're offering a simple, easy to consume, and affordable solution. Then you start having those elements of alignment to say, all right, well, because a lot of our proposition is going to be customer facing, then we need to align the front lines. Or perhaps our sales force is going to hate this idea because they're not going to make as much commission on it, and it's going to be a very simple thing to sell that their skills aren't necessarily all needed for. So we need to assume some resistance and go about commercialization in a totally different way. But if you don't start with understanding the why and the what, then that how of innovation, that how of organizational alignment can get very disconnected from your ultimate goals.
You mentioned, the idea like skunk works or innovation labs, a lot of those that you see around. I was speaking recently in Rome in Italy, and there was a telecoms company I was doing some stuff with, and they're building, their innovation labs, but it's very much looking at new products. I'm wondering, are there examples that you've seen of innovation labs, skunkworks, that are really focused, that they're not so focused on just necessarily just creating new products, but kind of what you're talking about in your book, about really thinking about costs and how we can kind of almost like create our internal competitor for ourselves?
That's right. No, we do see this. It is remarkable how when you ask who is responsible for new product development and what is the process they follow, most companies will have a very clear answer for that. But when you ask who's responsible for business model development and what process do they follow, most companies will just throw their hands up in the air and say, I have no idea, even though they recognize that business model innovation is at least, if not more powerful than product innovation. It can have a much longer shelf life. It can be much more impactful. So Medtronic, the industry leader in medical devices, has a unit that is devoted to business model innovation, and they create new business models. Sometimes those are integrated in with the rest of the company, like financing for pacemakers in India. Sometimes they're very different, like a lower end pacemaker that's sold in a very different manner to hospitals in Europe that are just offering tenders for devices and aren't looking for all the bells and whistles that have come to adorn that product. So that they've been able to commercialize both those innovations, albeit in very different ways, because they have a set way of doing that. And they also have the flexibility to interact with the rest of the organization in a idea appropriate way. They don't just follow the same playbook for every single concept they have.
And so I know some other examples that you cite in the book as well, and case studies, as LegalZoom is one of the ones you talk about, obviously very cost focused there. But another one which I didn't necessarily think of as a kind of cost focus, which was Planet Fitness.
Yes.
Can you tell a little bit about that story? I mean, how that relationship came about, how you kind of found them as an interesting model to look at, and what your kind of key takeaways were from that case study?
Yeah, so finding Planet Fitness was very easy because they have a gym about 100 meters from our office. So we have plenty of people who use Planet Fitness, and they said, wow, I really love it. And oh, by the way, it's $10 a month. So the remarkable thing about this chain is that it is the super fast growing chain in the United States. It's up to 10 million members. It leads the fitness industry in customer satisfaction. And yet it is just about the cheapest gym out there, $10 a month, when there's competition that's $50 a month or even $100 a month. Now, there's a lot that the Planet Fitness customer forsakes. They don't have the free weights. They don't have personal trainers oftentimes. They may not even have fresh towels. But they do have a cardio gym that's open 24/7. And there will almost always be machines available. So you get in, you get out, you do your routine. Is that appropriate for Arnold Schwarzenegger? No. The real fitness buffs are looking for something else. But Planet Fitness has made very clear choices in who its customers should be. They are aiming for the casual exerciser who's not going to be there every day, who's not going to be there for 2 hours a day. They might come twice a week. They come in, they get out. and they use a very standard set of equipment. So it is a very low cost model to run. It's highly efficient. They put in a few bells and whistles that are devoted to that customer, like free pizza on a Tuesday night, to send the message that everybody is accepted here, not just the fitness nuts. And they end up just minting money because they know what mouse they're trying to catch, and they have built a better mousetrap for that mouse than anyone else.
But I love that. I love the fact that, what you're talking about is that this innovation at all levels in different ways. Talking from the cost side. I was talking the other day with Josh Linkner, who's a keynote speaker on innovation, and Josh was telling me an amazing story, which I think he uses in some of his keynotes now, about a former prison inmate, who was in solitary for many weeks and couldn't exercise, so he did use his own physical body, and then when he came out into society, he wasn't able to get a job. So in the Lower East Side of New York, he decided to start a gym, which is basically looks like the inside of a prison, inside of a jail, and there's no weights, no nothing. It's all you just using your own body, and so that's and the way that it's marketed. In fact, when you get your membership card, it's like an inmate. You're not called members, you're called inmates, I think is the thing. so I love it. All these different. That's a cool thing about innovation. Whether it's like that, which is very much more about defining a product in a different kind of way and kind of going for a certain type of person, certain type of market, or what you're talking about, which is quite cost driven as well. It's just a fascinating area in terms of how you can approach innovation in different ways.
That's right. That's why I love it. So one of our favorite innovators noted in the book was actually another former prisoner, Genrich Altschuler, who was in the Soviet labor camps. And he was actually put there for what they called inventors sabotage. So you got to watch out for that if you're in the innovation field.
Yeah, I think I've met some of those people, those inventors, saboteurs.
So his idea, he was an engineer, but his idea in the camps was, what if you could create some sort of very disciplined mechanism to think up the unexpected? One of the virtues of that camp in Siberia is there wasn't a whole lot of other stuff to do. So he was able to really think through things and brainstorm with his fellow inmates. And he came up with something that in Russian is known by the acronym TRIZ. Now, it was very Soviet in that it was extremely complicated. But what we've tried to do is simplify that into a set of questions about really disaggregating, what does your product or service do? What are some assumptions that have baked into that from a long time ago that not everybody really requires you to do? What would be a really awful product for your market, and why would people hate it? Are there things that you could remove about why people would hate it that would make them hate it less? Things that push your imagination in very discrete sort of ways. And therefore let you reimagine the business or the product for that matter. When we do some workshops, we get people to say, okay, it's a hot day outside. Let's imagine we're going to be selling ice cream. How can we sell more ice cream? And right away, you get people to talk about more flavors, no calories, free. So, okay, yeah, that's nice, but that's hard to do anything with, and that's not very imaginative. And then you ask people why they bought an ice cream, and they give you totally different stories. I was celebrating after my girls' softball game. I wanted to do something impulsive with my wife on night out. I just had some spicy Indian food at home, and we were looking for something to sort of cut the edge off that. Almost all of these people have never been in the ice cream business. And yet immediately they put on these blinders of, okay, I'm in the ice cream business, therefore I'm going to think like super narrowly. So imagine for the business that they've been in for 15 years, what it's like. You put on the blinders so quickly and you forget what the customer really demands. I think through a disciplined process and set of questions, you can get there. You just have to be willing to step back from everything that you've assumed to be true about your industry.
And it's interesting just now as we're currently where we are in the economic cycle of things, things are booming in a lot of places and a lot of parts of the world. The economy is doing pretty well. So those Costovation chops maybe have become a little bit flabby, those muscles, because they're not having to drive. So everyone's talking about new product innovation and when it comes to innovation, but the cost part, when we come into the next part of the cycle, which will inevitably happen at some point, being in a position to have been thinking about kind of cost in a way and thinking in an innovative way about cost is going to put you in a pretty good shape for that next stage.
That's right. Look, the bad news that people don't want to hear is that recessions don't pre-announce themselves. They arrive and inevitably people are a little off guard. And once the recession hits, then people have little patience for investing over the year or 2 years or 3 years that it takes to really create a business model innovation. And so they just sort of hobble through and they cut the meat as well as the fat, but they don't often have the ability to rethink things. There are exceptions. Look, 2009 was my best year ever in innovation consulting up to that point, because people realized they had to do something significant. But the demand was not from a whole lot of clients. It was from a few that said, wow, we can't be toying around here anymore. We've got to get serious about this. So this doesn't mean that you have to spend a humongous amount of money, but you do need some time. You do need some people. You do need to give it some thought. And it's very hard to do that when you're under the gun to cut 10% of your costs by tomorrow.
Yeah, and it's sometimes like with Japanese poetry, you're very constricted in something, and actually sometimes that can actually lead to great creativity because you have this constriction that you have to get super creative in a small number of words, and so with cost of that, if you're constricted, as long as you are given enough freedom to be able to generate ideas, to develop ideas, to create your minimum viable products, to test assumptions, then some very good things can come. So as you've been going through your own journey, can you maybe tell us about a time when you worked on a project, perhaps an innovation project, and you gave it your heart and your soul, but for whatever reason, it just didn't work out like you'd hoped? And more importantly, what were the lessons that you took from that experience?
That's a really good question. So I worked with a company years ago, about a dozen years ago, looking at a broad range of medical type devices that could be consumerized, sold over the counter. And we looked at things like fitness trackers and all sorts of things that have since become common. So a couple of things went wrong there. First of all, we had a hard time understanding the adoption cycle for this stuff. So there's a social element to adopting innovation sometimes, in that people want to get validation from others in their community, not just understand the benefits of the device, but see other people using it. So fitness trackers have actually been around for a while, since basically the turn of the century, but hadn't caught on until pretty recently, because there wasn't enough social validation out there. And I think we all sort of missed that some things, other things not, right? Other things are much more, show me the data and then I'll adopt it, some sort of new air compressor or whatever. But fitness tracker is different, more personal, more emotional. But then organizationally, I have seen so many companies go off the rails because they charter some innovation program and they don't know what to do with it. So in the case of that company, looking at the fitness trackers and other things, they had not stipulated how far from the core they were willing to go. They did not have a plan about how many ideas should be commercialized per annum. And so therefore, they had also not worked that backwards to how many ideas they need to have at different stages of their pipeline. They had not integrated in the people who would ultimately catch the ball, who wouldn't just be coming up with the idea, but would be selling it into retail channels. So there were all sorts of disconnects, which honestly, a little bit of upfront planning would have helped this company avoid. But because it just sort of went for the idea and then fell in love with a bunch of ideas. Ideas are seldom the problem with innovation. It's, well, what do you do about the idea? that they got intoxicated by the concepts and lost sight of the end goal of how would this actually appear in market and make money in a sustainable way.
But I think that's interesting what you just said there about kind of working. I think it was Charlie Munger, who Warren Buffett said, "Invert, always invert." And this idea that if you're saying that 10% annually of revenues have to come from products which haven't been invented 3 years ago, whatever the number is that you're looking for, then like you need to kind of work back the way and think, well, how many new products do we need to be testing and coming up with all the time? I think that's interesting because I think regardless of whether you're a multinational company or whether you're just someone who is just doing individual creative work, maybe a design company, for example, or you're a speaker, whatever your role is, I think that's something that actually you can adopt to think about. Okay, I want to be innovative. I want that to be part of what we're about as a business. But do you have the process, and are you measuring that process as well?
That's right. Look for the new product enhancements. There's usually that process, but for the bold leaps, there is either a whole lot of ideas, and people assume if they throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall, somehow something's going to stick and be the one that they commercialize, or they fall in love with a couple of ideas, which more often than not tend to be the CEO or some other big executive's idea, and they just go 100 miles an hour in that direction. And look, there's no way that you would do a normal product enhancement that way. You certainly would never create a new business that way, unless you thought you were astoundingly lucky. But folks somehow think that there is some innovation magic that will occur where it will all just work out fine. And usually it doesn't. There is some degree of discipline that you need.
Now, in your own journey as an innovator, as a consultant that works with companies looking to innovate, was there a key aha moment or a light bulb moment, a time we went, oh, this is the direction we want to go with the work that we're doing with clients, or just maybe internally said, this is the kind of things I want to be able to do, the kind of legacy perhaps I want to leave the world?
Well, I have seen ranges of companies try to innovate. And, the big ahas for me come with smaller companies that are really able to put some energy in it and pull it off. I don't think a lot of the big innovations come from these gigantic enterprise-wide innovation campaigns. There are some exceptions, so it is possible that it's hard. But it is the companies in the middle who might have somewhere between 10 to $1 billion in revenue. Yeah, it's a big middle, right? It's a big range, but it is big enough to have the resources to experiment and to have a little bit of patience, but small enough that they don't have to send memos to people who they don't know, that they just sort of walk down the hallway, they make an agreement, and they get stuff done. As I saw more and more of our clients who looked like that be able to execute, I realized that these are the entities that do it best. So it could be a business unit of a bigger corporation. That's fine. There are certain behaviors that are required. So it's not just the process. It's also behavioral, internally, behaviors that are required. And there was a clarity of mission, not in terms of saving the world, but in terms of here's specifically why we're innovating, what we're trying to accomplish. Sometimes it was formal, sometimes it was more informal, but because it was a small group, it was well understood. And that clarity could align people to make some of the difficult decisions, which inevitably are going to happen when you're wrestling with a big innovation. So as I saw that, I realized that that is both a great client for us, but it's also the sort of organization that I encourage innovators to be relating themselves to. Big enough to have some flexibility, small enough to make decisions. It sounds simple, but it so often gets overlooked.
No, that's a great insight there. Let's talk about your tools and things that you use to do the work that you do. Are there any particular mobile tools or apps do you have on your computer that you find very useful for doing the innovative work that you do?
We try to keep it simple. There is one tool we use called Coggle, Coggle, which creates hierarchies. And as we think about how the objectives or the jobs to be done that people have interrelate, we find that a very useful way to keep track of how that works and how people can have very complex sets of intersecting objectives. I am not a big fan of fancy idea management tools because I think ideas are seldom the problem. It's more about coming up with the right ideas because you're asking the right questions, and then how you commercialize those ideas. So it's not that I would say don't use them, but I think they can get an inordinate amount of attention, whereas what people really need is the clarity of mission, the clarity of questions, and then the execution process.
And what about a book? If you to recommend one book, we're going to have links to obviously your Costovation here as well, and some of your other books. But if you to recommend one book by another author you think people should check out, it could be on innovation or a topic you feel passionate about, what would that book be?
So my favorite innovation book of all time is not one of my own, but by Clay Christensen, who, as you noted, I worked with for 6 years. And it's actually not The Innovator's Dilemma, although that's an amazing book. It's the follow-on. It's called The Innovator's Solution, which fewer people read. But I find you have a lot of the core content of the dilemma in there, and yet you have a lot of other concepts about test and learn strategies, about jobs to be done. They're introduced all in that book. So Clay gives you a whole toolkit of things, as well as the mechanisms for identifying innovation opportunities through the Innovator's Dilemma, disruptive innovation frameworks that he lays out in some of his earlier work. It's a 2003 book. It's terrific.
And what about an album or a record? Is there some music that you find that you really enjoy, you want to recommend to people?
Nobody ever asks me that. Look, I live part of the year in Puerto Rico. I find that's where I am now. I find this island has a tremendous amount of creative energy. So some of the things that Daddy Yankee does, for instance, I think just take reggaeton or rap in totally new directions. When you're rebuilding after a hurricane and there's not a lot of job prospects, it's amazing what people will do with their minds. And it's not just in the music, it's in the art, it's in the food. This is a tremendously creative place. So Puerto Rican music, you can check out Daddy Yankee as one of those people.
I have never heard of this artist, so this is something I'm going to check on Spotify. And we'll put a link for everyone else, so if you want to know what that sounds like, you can go and check that as well. And a final question for you. I want you to imagine you woke up tomorrow morning and you have to start from scratch. So you can choose anywhere in the world to restart from, but you have no contacts, no one knows you, you know no one, you have to restart. What would you do? How would you restart?
Wow. Well, look, I'll relate this to what I sort of did before because this worked really well. So I lived in London for 4 years. I was developing smartphones, doing mobile middleware and software. And then I moved to Zambia, and people thought I was nuts. But I joined a startup telecom operator down there, and I started up mobile commerce in Africa. We were the first mobile commerce business. And we did great. We did a lot better doing that than we ever did in London, for heaven's sake. And that's because there was nothing. And we had the freedom to do a tremendous amount of things, and there was so much need. People were paying for a truckload of beer in cash, and the highest denomination bill was worth $2. So you can imagine the amount of cash. There was need all over the place. So finding places that are not super hyper crowded, but where there is just a landscape of need and opportunity. I find that you can get some tremendously great ideas just being naive in those environments, looking at where the pain points lie, and then using the arsenal of either knowledge you have about other places or just technologies or ideas you might have on your own to create novel, rapidly accepted solutions.
Wonderful. And if people want to connect with you, reach out to you, find out more about the book as well, where's the best place for them to go and do that?
Sure. So the easiest place to go is the website for the book, which is Costovation.com. And that website lives on the website of my company, New Markets Advisors. So you can find me, more about the company, and you can certainly find a lot of tools and downloadable content from the book, Costovation.com.
Well, Steve, it's been a pleasure speaking to you today. I love the whole Costovation concept. I think it's something time has come as well, and I wish you all the best with the book.
Great. Thank you very much.
If you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.